This bodybuilder right here, he couldn't train, but he still became Mr. Olympia. So how did he do it? With torn biceps, torn triceps, and nagging back problems, Dorian still managed to become a 6-time Mr. Olympia champion. He kickstarted the mass monster era, challenging the very standards of what a winning physique should look like. He showed the world that insane size, combined with razor-sharp conditioning, could outshine the more classic lines that people were used to in the 80s. But how did he do it? Dorian competed during a transition in bodybuilding. Lee Haney had just wrapped up his historical run of 8 Olympia titles, showcasing balanced mass and a friendlier look. Then, Dorian stormed in with a denser, more monster-like physique. Rivals like Kevin Levrone, Sean Ray, Flex Wheeler, and Nasser El Sambati each tried to match his thickness but could not quite pull it off. Many fans marveled at his freakish back development, calling it the best in history, while some critics accused him of destroying the old-school aesthetic. Dorian Andrew Yates was born on April 19, 1962 in Hurley, Staffordshire, England. Soon after, his family moved to Birmingham, a greedy industrial city that did not offer much for a kid with minimal resources. Money was tight and daily life was tough. When he was 13, Dorian's father passed away from a heart attack. That loss left him adrift, forcing him to grow up without a guiding role model. Birmingham in the late 70s and early 80s was marked by high unemployment and a surge in street crime. Dorian, already lacking direction, found himself pulled into gang culture. He started hanging out with rough crowds, getting into fights, and getting involved with serious trouble. Eventually, he was arrested during a street fight and sent to a youth detention center. During his time there, he already sensed that his life could take a positive turn. The atmosphere was almost military-like. Mornings began with disciplined marches around the yard, and during the day, the boys learned a trade. Dorian chose plastering. Yet it wasn't just about work. There was plenty of physical training as well. They did circuit workouts and even some weight training, and one officer noticed Dorian's natural strength, urging him to visit a powerlifting gym once he was released. That's because he saw real potential in him. But as soon as he started hitting the weights, something clicked. He felt control and purpose that he never had before. Instead of a dead-end existence on the streets, he saw a faint glimmer of a new path. He thought if he could change his body, then maybe he could change his life. And when he got out, he faced a dilemma. On one hand, the streets were still there. Easy money, quick adrenaline, the only life he had known. On the other hand, there was bodybuilding, which required discipline, dedication, and most of all, hope. He had no sponsors, no mentors, no solid gym connections. He was a world away from California's sunshine and iconic Gold's Gym. But he chose to give bodybuilding a try. He knew that if he stayed where he was, he risked either ending up back in jail or becoming just another statistic. So he jumped headfirst into the world of lifting, seeking any training tips found in magazines and scraping by to afford decent food. Temple Gym in Birmingham became his fortress. It was a cramped basement space, dimly lit, with a damp chill in the air. Water leaks sometimes dripped from the ceiling, and the equipment was battered. To most people, it seemed like a dungeon than a gym, but to Dorian, it was a sanctuary. He realized that this new passion was truly his shot at a better life. If he failed, he feared he'd slip back into the cycle of street crime, drifting without ambition. But if he succeeded, who knew how far he could go? Dorian's first major obstacle was figuring out how to train effectively. He devoured magazines about Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sergio Oliva, reading that they relied on high-volume routines, multiple sets, endless exercises, a marathon gym session every time. He tried that approach for a while, but quickly felt drained.
In the gym, and if I trained more often, or if I did more in the gym, my progress would slow down or it would stop. As soon as I cut back and I made the workout shorter and more intense, my progress went. So for me, it was pretty early on I learned how to train properly.
He worked odd jobs to support himself, so spending hours in the gym just was not feasible. But then he stumbled across Mike Mentzer's high-intensity training philosophy, which focused on fewer sets but maximum effort. Dorian experimented, adjusting every detail to suit his body. He discovered that doing just 1 or 2 brutal work sets per exercise, each set taken to the absolute limit with forced reps or negatives, yielded incredible muscle growth. This revelation shaped his entire career. He'd show up at Temple Gym, warm up meticulously, and then hammer his muscles with short, explosive, all-out sets.
I was doing average 45, 50-minute workouts, probably 4 times a week.
The environment was perfect for such an approach. It was gritty, quiet and nobody was there to distract him. He would not do endless volumes of curls or bench presses, just a warm-up and then a set to absolute failure to each muscle group.
But the real sets I call them, we're going to go to absolute failure and even beyond with force reps, with assistance reps, maybe extra negative reps, which is something that most people neglect when they lift weights. They think...
Because of that, his muscles grew thicker than local bodybuilders who followed more traditional methods, and by 1985 he felt ready to compete, so he entered the Mr. Birmingham contest. It was his first contest, and he did not have any experience. But he walked on stage and shocked everyone with his dense, heavy muscles. He won convincingly, and that victory lit a fire in him. He thought if he could dominate a local show this easily, maybe he can dominate at the national level too. Over the next few years, he honed his technique. His back began to stand out with an almost freakish thickness. He built up his legs through heavy squats and hack squats, each performed with that same high-intensity technique. He did not suddenly land in wealth, but after that local win, a few perks and a small bit of support and recognition from the public rolled in. He was able to funnel every bit of energy and money he had into bodybuilding, measured his meals more carefully, and squeezed in supplements whenever he could afford them. He rarely parted from Temple Gym, training alone in the basement with the lights sometimes flickering, water dripping, and the walls sweating from humidity. He'd only eat for his new purpose, lean proteins like chicken, fish, and egg whites, plus lots of rice and oats for carbs. He could not afford fancy supplements back then, but he made do with basic protein powders or anything he could find at local shops. Competition after competition in the 1986 IFBB World Games and the 1988 EFBB British Championships, he kept on winning.
Novice contest, absolutely, like, I didn't know at the time, I just thought this is where I need to be, but now I look back, it's like there's no comparison. I won the contest so easily. Then I had like judges and officials. There was one guy, Ron Davis, he used to judge at the Mr. Olympia.
He dreamt of stepping onto the Olympia stage one day, though he was still miles away in every aspect. He was a fast learner, constantly adjusting. He noted every minor failure or strength deficit and then attacked it in the next training period after his competition. If his arms looked small in this pose, he will fix that. If his legs can be leaner, he will work on them even more. Each show he attended taught him a lesson. So, by the late 80s, he was a well-known figure in the British bodybuilding scene, all thanks to that harsh method he had crafted in a gloomy basement. But challenges soon piled up like weights on a barbell. First, he faced criticism about his physique. Some argued that he lacked the classic proportions of guys like Frank Zane, who had a tiny waist, broad shoulders, and a shredded physique. Dorian's midsection was thicker, giving him a blocky look. He also did not relish media appearances, interviews, or playing the role of a charming public figure. Sponsors wanted personalities, but he was more of a nonchalant loner. Second, his relentless training style started raising concerns about injuries. High-intensity sets are extremely taxing on tendons and joints, especially when going for personal records in deadlifts, barbell rows, and squats. So he began feeling aches in his lower back. Nothing too severe at first, but it was a red flag. He realized if that ache turned into something bigger, he'd be out of the sport. That meant no earnings from competitions, no potential sponsorship money, no future. His livelihood and identity were staked on staying healthy enough to keep competing. Third, competitions internationally such as the 1990 and 1991 Night of Champions in New York, USA drained his thin budget. He had to spend on flights, hotels, contest fees, and specialized diet requirements. He often had to borrow money or make do with the cheapest accommodations. If he hadn't placed well, he'd be in serious financial trouble. To Dorian, it was a constant gamble. Meanwhile, the bodybuilding world was evolving, and new talents emerged each year. He saw guys like Sean Ray, who had a more symmetrical look, or Kevin LeVron, who boasted rounder muscles. He would compare his structure to theirs and think, they might have a better shape, but I can outsize them if I keep pushing. Still, the weight of expectations, financial stress, and the risk of injury made every single day feel like climbing a mountain. Despite these obstacles, he made an explosive entrance on the global stage at the 1991 Mr. Olympia. The favorite was Lee Haney, an absolute monster with a legendary back on top of world-class conditioning and symmetry, going for his 8th Mr. Olympia title.
Because Lee Haney was kind of like head and shoulders above everybody else as far as stature and muscle size and everything like that. And I was on a fairly equal scale by the time I was going to compete against him in those departments. So.
In prejudging, things got intense. Everyone realized Dorian was the only one who could match Henny's size, at least in some poses. Meanwhile, Henny was playing mind games. He kept his tracksuit backstage and in the gym, never fully revealing his condition until the very last moment. When he finally took it off, he showed off an insanely thick back that dropped jaws on the ground. It was a psychological blow. Henny's traps, lats, and overall weight looked unbeatable. And people were already mumbling that even if Dorian had great conditioning, he might not overcome Henny's legendary combination of mass and shape. As a result of this, no one thought our British newcomer would even pose a threat.
The Englishman came out to the biggest cheer in the contest. Since his Night of Champions win, he's packed on another 5 pounds. The 240-pound final product being noticeably improved by more delt width and thickness.
Dorian ended up placing second, with Lee Haney earning his Mr. Olympia title for the 8th time in a row. He did not beat Henny, but he pushed him harder than anyone had before.
Even though Dorian won the muscularity round, Haney topped him in posing and symmetry and went on to win his record-breaking 8th Mr. Olympia title.
Dorian later recalled how Henny looked at him. At one point, Dorian felt like Henny gave him a little knuckle, almost like a playful jab, saying, "Okay kid, try to match this," and that was Lee Haney's way of letting him know that this is still his throne. In the muscularity round, Dorian's raw density actually took the edge, but Henny's superior symmetry and refined stage presence helped him clinch that record-breaking 8th Mr. Olympia. It was a big win for Henny's supporters, who believed in his perfect balance of mass and aesthetics. Dorian took second in the closest battle Henny had faced in years.
You know, I probably pushed him more than anyone had pushed in the past. In bodybuilding, there's 3 rounds. He won 2 rounds and I won 1, which I don't think had happened before.
With Henny announcing his retirement right after, it signaled to the entire bodybuilding world that Dorian was next in line. Earning second place in your first Olympia was almost unheard of, so people immediately realized that the Englishman would be the man to watch out for in 1992. People in the crowd mumbled, "That guy's physique looks different, like a slab of concrete." The judges and fans noticed his unique blend of mass and conditioning, although his blockiness was still debated. After this show, Dorian felt both pride and hunger. He had almost defeated the greatest champion of that era on his first try. When he returned to Birmingham, he reflected on his near miss. He thought he was so close to winning. One more year of focused training and he can take the throne. So, he dove back into Temple Gym, analyzing every piece of feedback. He zeroed in on improving his arms, refining his posing, and tightening his midsection. He believed if he corrected those weaknesses, the Olympia crown would be his to take. By 1992, the Olympia was set in Helsinki, Finland. Henny had retired, so the title was up for grabs. Dorian arrived with a physique that made even his 1991 version look small. He was bigger, denser, and had that trademark grainy conditioning that no one else could match. In the contest, it was clear that while Lee Haney had always been admired for his classic well-shaped physique, he was never the mass monster that Dorian had become. The previous champion had aesthetics and balance, but Dorian brought out bigness and raw size that left no match for his muscularity, especially when it came to his back and lower body. The judges and fans saw a massive contrast. Henny's back, though beautifully sculpted, could never compare to Dorian's mountain-like lats and powerful thick traps, and his legs were as solid as pillars, built with explosive squats and heavy leg presses that showcased unparalleled density. When the final round arrived, the challenges of the contest were evident. Dorian faced obstacles in the form of extreme comparisons and bias from judges who had been conditioned by the previous era of balanced symmetrical physiques. Every competitor was a formidable opponent, but Dorian's approach was different. He was not just there to look good, he was there to dominate. His posing routine was a masterclass in controlled aggression. He executed a series of front double biceps, slide chest, and back double biceps poses with such precision that even the smallest flaw was almost unnoticeable. He tilted his body just at the right angle to emphasize the depth of his back and the thickness of his legs, all that while carefully adjusting his posture to minimize any blockiness in his midsection. When it was time to announce the winner, Dorian stood victorious, holding onto his first Sando trophy. It felt surreal. He was a man who had grown up poor, without a guiding role model, and who had nearly been lost in a world of violence, now crowned as the best bodybuilder on the planet. The moment was both a dream come true and a stark warning. With each victory came the burden of expectation. He knew that as a champion, a target would be put on his back every year, with challengers lining up to dethrone him. He had achieved his dream of becoming Mr. Olympia, but he also sensed the enormous pressure mounting for every future contest. Winning again in 1993 pushed him further into the spotlight. He was called the Shadow for his habit of training in secrecy, rarely doing media, and then appearing at competitions to steal the win from everyone. But the demands to improve every single year soon took a physical toll. He ramped up the weights, determined to keep outgrowing the competition. But his back pain intensified. He started feeling sharp pains in his lower spine, forcing him to wear a lifting belt for almost every session. Then, right before the 1994 Olympia, he tore his left bicep.
And I was like, here I am, top of the mountain, my career's over. That's it, torn bicep, it's a really bad injury, career's over.
A bicep tear can be catastrophic. It affects symmetry and proportion. Even with surgery, the muscle never looks completely the same or restores 100% of its strength. Judges often look for symmetrical arms, especially in front poses. For a champion like Dorian, this was a disaster. Most people would have taken that year off and focused on recovery, but not Dorian. He insisted on competing. He learned posing tricks. Instead of fully flexing the arm, he would slightly bend it to make the muscle look more natural. In front double biceps, he angled his left arm slightly lower to make the asymmetry less obvious. In the back double biceps, he tilted his scapula to make his left biceps appear fuller. But he also used the stage. He stood slightly away from the light so the judges could not see the visible tears. And he added dark tan and oil to reduce contrast on the skin, making the injury much less noticeable. But judging was still on his side. This was the most important part. How judging goes in a bodybuilding contest starts with 4 semi-relaxed poses, and the bicep is not visible in those poses, so the bicep would not affect any of them. And then you have 7 compulsory poses, starting with the front double bicep. This is where the injury would affect him the most, but even if he lost in this pose, he could win in all of the other ones.
Right? It wouldn't matter mathematically because I would still win the majority of the other poses. Nobody could beat me on a front lat spread. Nobody could beat me on a back lat spread. Nobody could beat me on a back double bicep and a side tricep. And probably not on abs and thighs either.
He won again, but the bicep never fully recovered, leaving a slight deformity that forced him to shift more load to his back when doing the rows. This, however, led to even more issues as his back pain escalated further. He refused to let go of his title. He won in 1995 even though his deadlifts and rows were wrecking his spine. The pain was not enough to slow him down, he just kept pushing. Then he won again in 1996, but the left bicep tear limited him more than it seemed. He felt weakness and intense pain on every single lift from that arm. His physique was still the best in the world, but he was fighting pain every single day. It became a cycle of winning shows and breaking himself at the same time. He piled up 4, then 5 Mr. Olympia crowns, all while dealing with tendonitis in his elbows and an increasingly unstable spine. Pain management became his routine. By early 1997, the aches turned constant, and he could feel his body screaming for a break. Then, the unthinkable happened. He tore his triceps just weeks before defending his title. This was not a small tweak. It directly threatened his pressing movements and was clearly visible on stage. Doctors told him to skip the contest and think about his future, but this was never his style. He'd come too far to walk away, even if it meant risking everything.
But 3 weeks out, I tore my tricep tendon pretty much totally off the bone. And really, it was almost looking impossible for me to compete, but Had this experience in '94 where I was injured and I felt like giving up and not competing. So like, you've been through this already once before.
And then '97, I tore tendon almost like 100% tricep tendon. I think it was hanging on by 5%. And I couldn't train, I couldn't do anything.
His mind kept spinning. If he doesn't show up, everyone will say that he ducked the competition. And if he does show up, then he might lose everything because of his injuries. But if he pushed his tricep too hard, he could ruin it permanently. He felt cornered. He was chasing a 6th consecutive title, something only a few legends had ever got close to. But now he can't even train normally. He had to alter his chest, shoulder, and triceps workouts. His workout split looked something like this. Day 1 was delts, triceps, traps, and abs. Day 2, back and rear delts. Day 3 was a rest day. Day 4, chest, biceps, and abs. Day 5 was another rest day. Day 6 for quads, hamstrings, and calves. And day 7 is another rest day. 1 to 2 warm-up sets, 12 to 15 reps, and then 1 working set of 8 to 10 reps. He used the machines more than usual to protect his joints. No more free weight barbell rows. He replaced them with a hammer strength machine rows. He limited heavy overhead presses for shoulders, but he still did Smith machine presses, and he was very careful with the amount of weight that he used, skipping the heaviest movements, praying the rest of his physique would still carry him. He also worried about the fans. They would expect the unstoppable Dorian Yates, not a diminished, broken version. This was the moment he nearly gave up all hope. His career was on the line. After this competition, he would have to retire whether he won or lost. He thought, I'm not even sure if I can go through with it. My body is collapsing. It felt like the walls were closing in on him. When the 1997 Mr. Olympia finally arrived, Dorian stepped onto that stage with a torn tricep hidden behind strategic posing angles, so he took extra care in the front double biceps by angling his body slightly. That way his left arm was not fully exposed. On the side chest, he positioned his injured arm at just the right angle to conceal the tear's outline. He was still huge, still unbelievably dense. But that vulnerability remained. Competitors like Nasser Sanbati and Sean Ray smelled blood and the last reserves of his massive physique. They saw a chance to dethrone the 5-time champion. Dorian, however, had a warrior's mindset. He said to himself he will do everything it takes to hold on to this title, even if it's the last time he can stand on stage without crippling pain. Through prejudging and finals, he stuck to poses that minimized the visibility of his torn tricep. His back poses were still very dominant. His quads and hamstrings were as thick as ever. His midsection, while never really narrow, appeared well controlled for the night. The judges deliberated. Some argued Nasser had the shape to beat Dorian. Others said Kevin Levrone looked incredible and he could take first place. But in the end, Dorian's sheer size and hardness edged him over the competition. He was crowned Mr. Olympia for the 6th consecutive time. He felt a surge of relief and also finality. Backstage, tears in his eyes, he confessed to those close to him that he had pushed his body beyond its limits. He had nothing left to prove and he was done. Later, he explained that if he kept going, he would permanently injure himself and ruin his health. So, he walked away from the stage a champion, battered but on top. Despite overwhelming odds, he refused to be dethroned. He forced his battered body to one last victory and then vanished from competition. This sealed his legacy as a man who would not yield against all odds. After 1997, Dorian stepped away from the competitive stage. He needed time to heal. His body was riddled with old injuries and chronic aches. Still, he had cemented himself as one of the greatest Mr. Olympia champions ever, sitting alongside names like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Lee Haney, and later Ronnie Coleman. He had redefined what judges considered the ultimate bodybuilding look by emphasizing extreme mass and density. Many say that he paved the way for Ronnie Coleman to dominate in the early 2000s with an even bigger physique. But those who saw Dorian at his peak believe he was the real game changer. Physically, he never returned to that monstrous shape.
And I knew after my injury, I had an injury in '94, of course, the torn bicep, and I had another one, tricep tendon tear in '97. And I knew after that that I couldn't
I couldn't be at my best, so there's no point competing if you can't be at your best.
He eased back on the insane training, focusing instead on staying healthy. Mentally, he seemed at peace with his decision. He openly discussed how pushing for more size each year took a toll on his joints, tendons, and overall well-being. He also admitted that while high-intensity training was effective, it required meticulous attention to form and recovery, something that might be incompatible with lengthy careers. But he still had no regrets. He viewed it as the necessary sacrifice for escaping a horrible future and instead becoming a 6-time Mr. Olympia. Dorian's influence stretched far beyond the trophies. His blood and guts training style, as documented in his video series, inspired hundreds of thousands of lifters worldwide to adopt low-volume, high-intensity workouts. Temple Gym became legendary. Fans traveled from across the globe to see the little basement where this living legend was born. Photos of him doing heavy barbell rows or T-bar rows in near darkness captured imaginations. His quiet, introverted approach also resonated with a lot of fans who loved his personality and attitude. He was not the big smiling camera-hugging celebrity. He was a man on a mission, letting his results speak for him. At the same time, critics blamed him for steering the sport toward blocky physiques and what would later be called bubble guts as athletes kept chasing extreme size. They claimed his success overshadowed the artful poses of the 70s and 80s. But even those critics admitted Dorian's commitment was absolute. On a personal level, Dorian became an entrepreneur, launching supplement lines and gym franchises. He traveled to speak at seminars, often warning young bodybuilders about the dangers of going too far. He shared that he had sacrificed a normal life for this sport. This surely had affected his first marriage and potentially was a crucial reason for his divorce with his ex-wife Deb. He endured constant pain and risked permanent injuries, yet he also reminded them that real success requires real sacrifice. His story resonated with anyone who felt trapped by circumstance. He proved you could come from nothing, a rough neighborhood, a youth detention record, and still conquer the biggest stage in your field. He showed that if you pour every ounce of your being into one goal, you can change your destiny. If you have ever felt like your environment was holding you back or that you didn't have the right connections to reach your dreams, remember Dorian Yates. He rose from a troubled adolescence in Birmingham to become a 6-time Mr. Olympia, forging a new era in bodybuilding while battling brutal injuries that would have crushed most competitors. Do you think he was one of the greatest mass bodybuilders ever? Did he push the sport forward or shifted away from its golden age aesthetics? Let us know your own thoughts, because at the heart of it all is a man who refused to let limitations define him. That's the story of Dorian Yates, a man who paid the price in injuries and pain, but he never looked back. Thanks so much for watching this video, and see you guys in the next one.